I put this video today to a vote earlier this week, and what you guys voted for was putting the MoonDrop Venus up against the Ananda Nano. So that's what you're getting. Just for a recap, the Ananda Nano is the most recent edition of the Ananda released by HiFiMAN in the past month or so, and the MoonDrop Venus, one of the few over-ears made by MoonDrop, was released at the very end of 2022 in December. So the Nano is $600 and the Venus is $600. Like I said in my last Nano comparison video, this price tier is looking awfully crowded and very competitive. Not complaining though, this is what makes it a buyer's market. So if deciding between the Nano Ananda V1, V2, the Stealth, and the Edition XS wasn't enough for you, don't worry. We're about to complicate things even further with the Venus. We'll have a listening test a little later on in the video, talk about how these two fit and feel on your head, go over some technical design, and talk about what they sound like. But first, let's take a peek inside of their boxes. So for the Ananda Nano, you get your headphones, a kind of schmeh stock cable with a 3.5mm unbalanced jack, a 1/4-inch adapter, and a case. So as I've said before, really like to see HiFiMAN including a pretty decent enough carrying case with the Nano, as it's a lot more practical than the somewhat cheap foam headphone stands that they usually include with their headphones at this price point. Also, the MoonDrop Venus doesn't come with a case, so Nano wins a few points there. What the Venus does win some points over the Nano for, though, is its included cables, and comes with two pretty nice included cables. One of them is a 3.5mm unbalanced with nylon insulation, and the other is this pretty sexy 4.4 balanced 8-strand cable. By the way, if you're looking for just a solid, inexpensive 4.4 cable, I'm including a link below to buy the 16-strand and 8-strand version of this cable. Definitely recommend these as they have a nice and soft quality, look pretty cool, and they're also under $50. But anyway, love seeing the thoughtfulness from MoonDrop of including the cables with pretty solid build qualities. Also, it's maybe not rare, but not incredibly common to see 4.4s included with over-ears in this price range. So yeah, good to see. In conclusion, HiFiMAN's giving you a case, MoonDrop's giving you some nicer cables, but let's talk about the build and comfort and see if one of these can start to eke out a lead over the other. I'll start by saying that for all of the complaints that people might have about HiFiMAN build quality, the Nano really does have a solid quality going for it. Metal bracket, metal yokes, nice synthetic leather, suspension band. Maybe the only weakness I have to nitpick at is the plastic disguised as metal on the cans, but it doesn't feel cheap at all. It's perfectly on point. Now, the Venus has really just an exceptional build quality, especially at this price point with its aviation grade aluminum build. This thing is pretty much built like a tank, and I think you can probably tell even from where you're sitting that it looks really promising in terms of its durability and longevity. However, this build comes with one drawback, and that's the weight. It comes in at a pretty hefty 600 grams, but once it's on your head, I'm not so sure that you'd be able to tell that it's that heavy. The automatically adjusting suspension headband on it is really firm and buoyant, and just couples with a perfectly moderate clamp pressure, does a really excellent job distributing the mass comfortably, and yeah, the Venus is a very comfy headphone for more than just how it handles its weight. I'm a big fan of the fat, round, circumoral design that makes it easy to just set and forget. Also, the cushy pads that are ergonomically shaped to help you get a good seal. Only small complaint that I have for the Venus is some moderate heat buildup that occurs when the pads are pressing up against your face for a while. Didn't make me sweat, just felt a little stuffy. As for the Nano, we see the iconic HiFiMAN egg-shaped cans, and you get that lengthy ovular feeling when you're wearing it. Like the Venus, it also has a suspension headband, but unlike the Venus, it's fixed in place and adjustments are made on the notched sliders. And for headband pressure, it's a bit tight, which is something I personally appreciate, as I had issues getting good seals with previous editions of the Ananda, but it may be a little too tight for some listeners, and I have to admit I had to fidget with it a bit when I was wearing my glasses. So while I find the Nano adequately comfortable, the Venus is particularly comfortable and felt more casual on my head than the Ananda Nano. So, technical design. If you watched my last video, you already know the deal with the Ananda Nano. If you didn't, the Nano now features a diaphragm that is a single nanometer thick, a design element based on the super high-end, basically legendary HiFiMAN Susvara. This design characteristic leads to very fast decay times on the Nano. That is how quickly and accurately it can replicate the start and stop of a sound. Now, the Venus also has some very impressive technical design going for it. It features a really big driver that's 100 millimeters in diameter, also has a very thin diaphragm that is 2 micrometers thick. And this is also what we can consider a pretty thin diaphragm, but just to put how thin the Nano's diaphragm is into perspective, it's 0.05% the thickness of the one in the Venus. But anyway, we still have more to go over with the Venus here. The star of the show for the technical design might just be the FEA optimization, and FEA just means finite element analysis. You don't have to know what that literally means. All you have to know is that this ensures that the magnetic field produced by an array of 18 N52 magnets remains perfectly evenly distributed on the diaphragm. And worth mentioning that the last time I had to read about FEA was when I was reviewing the $4,000 open back flagship from Dan Clark, The Expanse. So it's pretty impressive to see such a premium design element in a $600 headphone. But all right, let's move on to the fun part now and have ourselves a little listening test using the mini DSP ears. First, I'm going to play the test file as a regular digital file, so you have that as a reference. Then we'll listen to it on the Ananda Nano, and then on the Venus. Just a refresher for listening tests, you're not hearing what the headphone really literally sounds like, but rather what your headphones or speakers that you're currently using sound like with a filter on it. In this case, a nano filter or a MoonDrop Venus filter. You can get the best sense of their balances by comparing them against one another and against this first reference file that I'm going to play. Also, sorry for how cheesy the track is. I'm just working with the copyright-free YouTube music library here. Anyway, let's do it, starting with the digital no headphones reference file. So let's talk about what we just heard there and what I also heard in my listens. The Venus is what I would categorize as a full sounding signature, while the Nano has this leaner and more dynamic signature to it. I think a lot of this has to do with the mids balance. Actually, the Venus has a pretty even keel with its mids, with a little bit of upper mid weight. But there's still considerable lower mid presence that gives it a thicker sound than what we heard on the Nano. It's almost certainly not an outright warm signature, but has a little bit of warmth to it. There's a more fluid continuity from the bass into the mid-range that the Nano doesn't really have. And this is what I'm referring to when I say the Venus sounds fuller than the Nano. So the Nano cuts some of its high bass, and it has much more of an apparent ramp in its upper mids. And these are some of its defining features. Some people might think it sounds a little more sterile and cold than the Venus, but the advantage in the Nano's tuning is the really stark separation between the mid-range and low end that it has going for it. So while its bass amplitudes are pretty similar to what we have in the Venus, I find low end parts, kick drums being the prime example, to really pop out on their own like extra pronounced layer. A similar thing can be said for the treble. The Venus isn't by any means a dark headphone. It even has elements of brightness going for it in its mid treble, but it's definitely a smoother, somewhat more gentle profile with less upper treble than the Nano. The Nano is making a statement in its mid and upper treble, which has this really wispy, sizzling sort of quality. And the Nano is definitely not V-shaped, but it has that extra low and high end sort of like boom bap dynamics that you might experience with V-shaped signatures. The Venus is kind of coasting along more smoothly in its tuning, while the Nano is throwing in more cuts and boosts to carve points of particular emphasis into its balance. And that's what I mean by it having a more dynamic sound to it. And now, just to wrap things up with their soundstage, the two actually have pretty similar sizes, but different dimensions. So with the Venus, I felt a really realistic forward-facing depth with it. At one point, when I was listening to a song that had a fade-in for the intro, I actually took the Venus off of my head because I thought that the music had started to come from my phone speakers, but it wasn't. It was just a very, very compelling holographic depth from the Venus. The Nano doesn't quite have the same depth, but I think it beats the Venus when it comes to its height, something that I suspect has to do with the size and shape of its cans. Hi-hats, cymbals, high-pitched, plucky strings and acoustic guitars, stuff with really sharp transients, basically, were parts that I felt towards the top of my forehead and a little higher than eyebrow level. Both have this really fast and fun, speedy imaging that, while a little on the smaller side, is very vivid and exceeds expectations for the price point we're talking about here. I would say that the two are equals in their spatial performances, but they just operate a bit differently. So TLDR for this comparison, the Venus. Full sounding, contains a little more of that warmth in it, even though it's not an outright warm signature, and has a more even presence across its balance than the Nano. It's a colder signature, but more impactful in its lows and highs, and has this more crispy sort of drive to it. So here's my 2 cents. Take it or leave it. Very much just my opinion, so you can fight me about this in the comments. I think that the Nano is a better sounding headphone. This is definitely in part due to its tuning, which is catered to my subjective preference of brighter tunings with cuts and high bass, but it's really everything about the sound I just find more exciting, controlled, speedy, and in general, it just hits hard. To give the Venus its due, it has this crazy strong build quality and really, really nice comfort going on for it. And it just seems like you could own it for 10 years, maybe routinely drop it, although I don't advise that, and it would still work. Also, it's a little more comfortable than the Nano at the end of the day, thanks to the suspension headband and also its circumaural design. To finally wrap things up though, even though my preferences lie with the Nano, I'm ultimately just very impressed with what we're seeing in this market tier when it comes to open back over ears. Both the Venus and the Nano are genuinely some of the highest value mid-tier headphones you can get right now, and I have much respect for the work that went into each of them. So despite my recommendations and preferences, be your own judge for this one. You can get 10% off an array of brands and items from Audio 46 by using code Chris10 at checkout. Code might not work for all brands and items, but if you're having issues with it, shoot an email to support@audio46 and they should be able to help you out shortly. I'm including links down below to purchase or read more about the Venus and the Nano from Audio 46. Anyway, this is Chris with Major Hi-Fi, and I'll see you guys next time.